History is not a story read from a book. It is a fragile framework built upon moments of profound chance, of terrifying risk, and of monumental decision. We look back upon the year 1944, and we see the inevitable march toward Allied victory. We see the beginning of the end. But the end was not written. The victory was not guaranteed. The date is June 6, 1944. The gray, churning waters of the English Channel are choked with the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled. Operation Overlord, the Great Crusade. Upon the shoulders of one man, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight David Eisenhower, rests the fate of the free world. He has weighed the forecasts, the intelligence, the astronomical risks, and he has uttered the famous words, "Okay, let's go." In our reality, despite the brutal, agonizing chaos on Omaha Beach, the landings held. The foothold was established. The long, bloody march to Berlin had begun. But the hinge of fate on that day was balanced on a razor's edge. It could have swung the other way. The pressure was inhuman, the logistics staggering. The German defenses, the Atlantic Wall, were formidable. The variable that terrified Eisenhower most was not the panzers, not the machine guns, but the weather. A storm had already forced a delay. He was gambling on a brief, precarious lull. But what if? What if that lull was a meteorological phantom? What if the storm, far from abating, returned with doubled, unforeseen fury, catching the invasion fleet in the open water? What if the meticulous deception, Operation Fortitude, had sprung a leak? What if German intelligence for once had listened to its best guesses and believed the invasion was coming, not at Calais, but at Normandy, and at this exact time? What if General Erwin Rommel, the one commander the Allies truly feared, was not in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, but was instead at the front lines, his elite panzer divisions fully fueled, mobilized, and waiting in the forests just beyond the beaches? This is the point of divergence. Not one failure, but a cascade. The storm hits mid-crossing, landing craft founder in 20-foot seas. The airborne drops behind enemy lines are scattered to the winds, not just disorganized, but annihilated. And as the first wave of seasick, terrified men stumble onto the beaches, they are not met by static defenses alone. They are met by a prepared, waiting, and overwhelming counterattack from the armor of the 12th SS Panzer and the 21st Panzer, unleashed the moment the first boot touched the sand. The battle is not a battle. It is a slaughter, a Dieppe on a scale 100 times worse. The Allied air cover, grounded by the hurricane force winds, is useless. The battleships offshore cannot acquire targets in the maelstrom. On Omaha, on Utah, on Gold, Juno, and Sword, the story is the same: chaos, fire, and death. By midday, it is no longer an invasion. It is a desperate, frantic evacuation under fire. In our world, Eisenhower had prepared a press release in case of failure. In this world, he is forced to read it. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. The Great Crusade is over before it began. The beaches of Normandy, which in our timeline became a symbol of liberation, are now a graveyard. The Atlantic Wall has not been breached. It has become impenetrable. The immediate consequence is a psychological cataclysm that rocks the Allied nations to their core. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, his health already frail, faces a vote of no confidence in Parliament. The staggering loss of life, the waste of years of preparation, is laid directly at his feet. His government teeters on the brink of collapse. The British people, who had endured the Blitz, now see only an endless, lightless tunnel ahead. In Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his own health failing, is politically shattered. The American public, fed a narrative of inevitable victory, is horrified by the casualty lists. The isolationist movement, which had been silenced by Pearl Harbor, rearses its voice, not as a political theory, but as a roar of public grief and anger. Not one more American son becomes the cry for Churchill's European fortress. But the most profound and immediate reaction comes from Moscow. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin, a man of brutal, paranoid pragmatism, receives the news. He does not see a tragedy. He sees a betrayal. He had been promised a second front. He had been promised relief for his bleeding Red Army. Now, he sees himself abandoned, left to face the full, undivided, and now victorious might of the Nazi war machine. In Berchtesgaden, Adolf Hitler is described by his staff as euphoric, messianic. His long-held belief in his own infallible intuition is now confirmed. He had dismissed the threat in the West, and he had been proven right. The Atlantic Wall, his monument of concrete and steel, had held. The decadent, cowardly democracies were broken. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine unleashes a torrent of triumphalism across the Reich. German morale, which had been buckling under years of bombing and losses in the East, soars. The generals of the July 20th plot, who, in our timeline, were weeks away from attempting to assassinate Hitler, now pause. Their entire premise, that Hitler was leading Germany to ruin, seems demonstrably false. The plot fizzles. Hitler is more secure, more powerful, and more worshipped than ever. And then, the dominoes begin to fall, fast and heavy. Hitler, with his western flank now utterly secure, gives the order he has longed to give. He turns everything to the east. The elite SS panzer divisions that had been waiting in France, the fresh infantry divisions, the entire production of the Luftwaffe which had been held back to fight the invasion, all of it now moves by rail, road, and air to the Eastern Front. In our timeline, on June 22, 1944, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration. It was a stunning, massive offensive that shattered German Army Group Center and tore the Eastern Front wide open. It was perhaps the single greatest German defeat of the war. In this new reality, the Soviets launch Operation Bagration. They have no choice. But they are not striking a thinned-out, weakened German line. They are slamming, headfirst, into a concrete wall of reinforced, elite, and battle-hardened divisions, fresh from their victory in France. The offensive, designed to be a blitzkrieg, becomes a meat grinder. The Red Army, which had already sacrificed millions, is bled white in the forests of Belarus. The advance stalls. It stops, and in some sectors, it is even pushed back. Stalin's gambit has failed. The war in the East is no longer a war of liberation. It is a desperate struggle for survival. Meanwhile, the war in the air changes dramatically. In our world, the Allied bombing campaign crippled German industry. But in this world, without the need to supply a land war in France, and with the Luftwaffe's full attention turned east, the priorities shift. Hitler, obsessed with his wonder weapons, the Wunderwaffen, now has the resources, the slave labor, and the security to build them. The Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, which in our world arrived too late and in too few numbers, now enters mass production in vast, bomb-proof underground factories. By early 1945, these futuristic jets sweep the skies of Allied propeller-driven planes. The B-17 and Lancaster formations that once darkened the skies over Berlin are now hunted to extinction. The Allies lose air superiority over Europe. The V-2 rocket program, no longer a mere terror weapon, is accelerated. London, which had hoped for a reprieve, is now subjected to a continuous strategic bombardment. But Hitler is not just targeting London. He unleashes his scientists on new, more terrifying projects. The New York rocket, the A9/A10, a multi-stage intercontinental missile, is given the highest priority. And the German nuclear program, led by Werner Heisenberg, which in our world was disjointed and under-resourced, now receives the full backing of a triumphant Reich. The race for the atomic bomb becomes terrifyingly, desperately close. In Italy, the Allied campaign, which had been a slow, grinding, secondary front, is now the only front, but it too falters. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, no longer having to siphon troops to France, reinforces his Gothic line. The Allies, stuck south of Rome and with morale collapsing, cannot advance. The war in Italy grinds to a halt. Let us now step forward into the world this single failed day has created. The year is 1953. The world map is a scar. The Second World War did not end in 1945. It simply changed. In the East, the war of attrition bled both the Reich and the Soviet Union to a pale, exhausted stalemate. By 1948, with both sides on the verge of total demographic collapse, a truce was signed. The Treaty of Pinsk establishes a new border. the Greater German Reich, is supreme. It controls all of Europe from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Poland, the Baltic states, and all of Western Russia are provinces of the Reich. Berlin, renamed Germania by Albert Speer, is the undisputed capital of a continent. The Soviet Union still exists, but as a truncated, paranoid hermit kingdom. Stalin, aged and bitter, rules over a rump state, his dreams of world revolution dead. He has been forced to look east, to Asia, for influence. In the West, Great Britain fought on, alone, for 2 more years. But under a relentless reign of improved V-2 rockets, some now tipped with chemical or crude radiological payloads, and with its economy in ruins and its people starving, the will to fight broke. In late 1947, Churchill, disgraced and exiled, watched as a new government led by collaborators and peace-seekers signed the Treaty of London. Britain is not occupied, but it is neutralized. It is a vassal state, its empire dismantled, its royal navy scuttled. The United States recoiled. After the D-Day disaster and the stalemate in Italy, the American people embraced a new, bitter isolationism. They finished the war in the Pacific. The Manhattan Project was completed, and atomic bombs were used to force the surrender of Japan in 1946. But the America that emerged was not a confident superpower. It was a fortress America, suspicious, angry, and turned inward. And what of the darkest chapter of the Reich, the Holocaust? In our timeline, Allied soldiers liberated the death camps in 1945. Their horrified reports and film reels awoke the conscience of the world. In this timeline, there is no liberation. The machinery of the final solution, efficient, industrialized, and now completely shielded from the world, runs and runs and runs. With no invading armies to disrupt its logistics, the program is carried out to its horrifying, absolute completion. There are no survivors to find. The camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor do not become museums of memory. They are simply dismantled, the evidence erased, their grim purpose fulfilled and forgotten. The new Cold War of the 1950s is not the two-way ideological struggle between Washington and Moscow that we knew. It is a terrifying, unstable, three-way standoff. First, there is the United States, a nuclear-armed democracy, but one that has retreated from the world stage. Second, the Soviet Union, which, through espionage and sheer desperate effort, finally detonated its own atomic bomb in 1952. And third, the Greater German Reich, triumphant, dominant, and by 1950, also a nuclear power. German scientists, using the resources of an entire continent and unhindered by Allied bombing, delivered the absolute weapon to their Führer. This is a world without the United Nations, a world without NATO, a world where the Iron Curtain is not a line through Germany, but a massive militarized wall separating the Reich from Stalin's rump state. The historical irony is profound. The technology that defined our post-war era is twisted. The space race, which in our world was born from the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, is now a Reich space program. Werner von Braun, who in our world surrendered to the Americans, remains Germany's top scientist. It is not Cape Canaveral, but Peenemünde, that is the center of rocketry. And in 1960, it is not an American or a Soviet who first orbits the Earth. It is a Luftwaffe pilot, launching from a base in occupied France. The first flag planted on the moon, perhaps by 1965, does not bear the stars and stripes. It bears a black swastika. Culture, art, and philosophy have stagnated under the sterile, brutalist classicism of the Reich. The baby boom, the rock and roll, the counterculture of the 60s, none of it happens. The world is a place of gray concrete, jackboots, and fear. A single storm. A single faulty piece of intelligence. A single general, present at his post instead of absent. These are the hinges upon which our reality turned. The failure of D-Day would not have just meant a longer war. It would have meant a different species of history. A world where the darkness of the 1940s did not recede, but instead consolidated, modernized, and reached for the stars. It forces us to ask a profound question. Is history driven by inevitable forces or by the fragile choices of individual men and women? This alternate reality, this dark mirror to our own, suggests the latter. It teaches us that the world we inhabit was not a given. It was not inevitable. It was bought. It was paid for in blood and courage on the sands of Normandy. The men who waded into the surf on June 6, 1944, were not just fighting for the liberation of France. They were fighting for the very shape of the century, for the possibility of the world we now live in. They were holding back a tide of darkness that, in another reality, consumed the globe. It reminds us that history is not written in stone. It is written in sand, constantly at the mercy of the next tide, of what if.